Hey everyone, Mr. Campbell here, and this lecture goes along with week 2 in my Modern American History 1865 to 2000 course with Homeschool Connections, in which we talk about the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons of Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and all these titans of finance and industry who were arguably some of the wealthiest and most influential men ever known. Remember, they possessed all this wealth in an age before there was an income tax. In the class, we talked a lot about the different industrialists and important companies like Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil, etc. And we talked a little bit about the labor union movement, but we didn't really talk about another reaction to the robber barons, which was socialism. So we're going to talk about socialism in this lecture for the honors course. The emergence of capitalism, it could have taken many forms. And by the way, I want to recommend an interesting book to you if you want to study this topic further. Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State. In The Servile State, he talks about how the rise of capitalism as an economic system paralleled the rise of industrialism. So for many people, industrialism and capitalism go hand in hand. It didn't have to be that way. That's just the way that it happened to develop historically. But the rise of the Industrial Revolution on the model of capitalism created in the late 19th century grave disorders in the world in terms of the conditions of the working classes. This, of course, elicited a famous encyclical by Pope Leo XIII in 1893, Rerum Novarum, on the condition of the working classes. And the problem was that with the rise of this big industry, so many millions of workers had become totally dispossessed of any property in any meaningful sense. They had nothing but their labor to offer. And they were often at the mercy of these big owners, these factories, who tried to pay them as little as possible, to work them in the worst conditions possible, to essentially squeeze them as much as they could, to use human beings as mere cogs in production, as mere units of production, with no real thought to the intrinsic value of human labor. The conditions were admittedly bad: child labor, long work days, dangerous working conditions, etc. This is what prompted the labor union movement to try to use the power of collective bargaining to redress some of these problems, to get things like an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, an abolition of child labor, essential minimum safety standards for the workplace, and so on. But at the same time as we're getting the rise of the labor movement, also there were many Americans turning to more radical solutions to the problems of capitalist industrialism, and that was the socialist movement. Now, socialism goes back a long way in the United States in various strains. The original Pilgrim Fathers had tinkered with socialism in Plymouth, or we could say with a communitarian idea. You always had these utopian communities, like the Shakers were I guess we call them utopian socialists. Robert Owen, the famous utopian socialist, had built several collective communities like New Harmony and these other places. They eventually failed for various reasons. But socialism was not really popularized until around 1888 by a book entitled Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. And Edward Bellamy wrote this story about the United States in the future, from the year 2000, in which the United States had become socialist, and it looks backwards on how the United States had adopted socialism as a means of redressing the inequalities that had been produced by capitalist industrialism. And Bellamy's book was extremely popular. By some counts, it was the most popular book of the 19th century, except for maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin. But those who were socially minded founded these clubs to discuss Bellamy's ideas in the book. They were called Bellamy clubs. One of the members of these Bellamy clubs would be Eugene Debs, the future president of the Socialist Party of America. So Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, kind of brought the idea of socialism before many Americans. Before that, you had really socialism was a German thing. Prior to Bellamy's book, you had a Socialist Labor Party founded in 1876 in Newark, New Jersey. It was overwhelmingly German. German immigrants that had come over, emigrated from the German Empire, and were imbued with the ideas of Karl Marx. The official language of the Socialist Labor Party was German for a while. The Socialist Labor Party would eventually split over internal disagreements, but the point is, until Bellamy's book, socialism was really kind of a European thing in the United States, but then it went mainstream in the 1880s and 90s. Now, we mentioned this character Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was influenced by Bellamy's ideas, a very early proponent of socialism. He formed a group called the Social Democratic Party. Now, after the collapse of the Socialist Labor Party, remnants of that group would fuse with Eugene Debs' group, and they would form a new organization called the Socialist Party of America in 1901. Eugene Debs was the face of socialism in the United States in the early 20th century. He was eloquent. He was passionate. Not anything like Bernie Sanders. Eugene Debs was a very eloquent speaker, very persuasive, had a genius for organization, for being in the right place at the right time, for making connections with people. And there was almost a religious fervor to the socialist movement, to Eugene Debs as a person, similar to the religious, almost religious devotion to the populist Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, which we talked about in class. If not this week, next week we talk about Bryan. But the socialist movement kind of fused together all these people who had been left behind in the new capitalist economy. Disaffected third parties of the late 19th century, such as the populists, the Silverites, but also radical miners, blacklisted railway workers, people who thought that the union movement wasn't going far enough. All these different groups were able to be brought together under Debs' socialist umbrella. The first socialist office holder in the United States was elected in 1897. It was a guy named Fred Hack from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who got elected as a city councilman in Sheboygan. He would later officially be recognized in 1932 by the Socialist Party as the United States' first elected socialist. And by the way, a lot of the strength of the Socialist Party in the United States would be around Wisconsin. Wisconsin has always been this center of progressivism and kind of outside-the-box third-party thinking in American political currents. At any rate, Debs' Socialist Party of America would work closely with the labor and union movements, and the socialists did things like organize strikes. They sometimes these strikes would turn to brawls, like in Ludlow, Colorado. In 1914, there was a strike at a mine, and it turned violent. And what I mean by violent, there was the National Guard was there. 176 people were arrested. There was dynamite. There was machine guns. 30 people were killed. This was not like the strikes of today. This was some violent stuff. So yeah, they weren't opposed to brawling either, using violence to try to get their means. But by and large, they were working through the electoral process, through political means, and they were a force to be reckoned with. It's not like today, where we think about socialism, we think about Antifa and Bernie Sanders and these ideas that seem kind of on the fringe. The socialists in the early 20th century were a mass movement. Their heyday was probably between World War I and World War II. But they died out eventually. Well, not died, they're still around today, but their influence waned after the death of Debs, who was their great leader, but also because, just because the government itself adopted some of the reforms that unions have been pushing for. Of course, throughout the early 20th century and during the administrations of both Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, There was moves to curb the power of big business, the antitrust acts, and then all the labor legislation through the 1930s and the New Deal era that really enshrined the place of collective bargaining in the American workplace really kind of took the teeth out of the early socialist movement. So socialism today is very different than what it was in the early 20th century. But anyhow, that's a little background about one of America's interesting political subcurrents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.